Lake Powell is sitting near 3,528 feet, only a few dozen feet above the level where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably produce hydropower for the Colorado River system. That number does not look catastrophic at first. The dam is still there, the water is still there, boats still move across parts of the reservoir, the Colorado River still flows below the concrete wall, but this is what makes the moment so unsettling. A reservoir does not have to vanish to become a crisis. It only has to fall below the elevations that the entire system was built to trust. And that is the part being missed. The danger is not simply that Lake Powell is low. The danger is that it is low in the wrong place, at the wrong time, inside a river system that supplies water and power to cities, farms, tribal communities, ecosystems, and economies across the American Southwest. But that is still not the scariest part. Dead Pool, at roughly 3,370 feet, is not just a deeper number on a chart. It is the name of a systemic limit. It is the point where water may still exist behind the dam, but the system loses the ability to move stored water the way people, laws, power grids, and downstream communities expect it to move. So the question is not only, how low is Lake Powell? The real question is this: what happens when one of the largest engineered buffers in the West can no longer buy time? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this story is not just about a lake in the desert. It is about what happens when old infrastructure meets a new climate. From Page to Mexico, the crisis becomes visible. To understand Lake Powell, you have to begin not with a satellite image, and not with a chart, but with the edge of the water. There, the first thing you notice is the white line. It runs along the canyon walls like a bathtub ring carved into stone, pale mineral stain against red rock, a memory of where the water used to be. It is not a forecast, it is not a model, it is a physical record written across miles of sandstone, showing that the reservoir once stood much higher than it does now. For visitors, that white line can look beautiful. For boaters, it can look inconvenient. For hydrologists, dam operators, tribal communities, power managers, and water officials, it means something much heavier. It means storage has been spent. Lake Powell is not a natural lake. It is a reservoir created by Glen Canyon Dam, built to hold back the Colorado River and convert a wild, seasonal river into a managed system. The reservoir is supposed to store water from wet years and release it through dry ones. It is supposed to help the upper basin meet delivery obligations to the lower basin. It is supposed to generate electricity. It is supposed to smooth the difference between snowpack in the mountains and water demand in the desert. But now, that smoothing function is under stress. Near the dam sits Page, Arizona, a city whose modern history is tied directly to Glen Canyon Dam. Page was not simply near the project, it grew because of it. Roads, jobs, tourism, housing, marinas, hotels, restaurants, maintenance crews, guides, mechanics, fuel stops, and seasonal workers all became part of a landscape shaped by the reservoir. When the lake is high, the economy feels the water. When the lake falls, the economy feels the absence. Boat ramps extend farther and farther down, exposed rock, marinas have to move, access points become complicated, tourists still come, but the geography of the lake changes. A place built around the assumption of a stable recreational reservoir has to keep adapting to a shoreline that refuses to stay put. But Page is only the first ring. Nearby is the Lecce chapter of the Navajo Nation. For many people outside the region, the Colorado River crisis is discussed in terms of acre-feet, hydropower, state allocations, and federal operating plans. Those terms matter, but for communities near the infrastructure, the crisis is not abstract. It appears as questions about water intake systems, electricity, jobs, affordability, roads, and whether emergency fixes arrive before low water turns from a technical concern into a lived disruption. That is one of the hidden truths of water infrastructure. The first impacts often fall on people who did not design the system, did not receive equal benefits from it, and do not have the same political power when choices become painful. Then the circle widens. Below Glen Canyon Dam, the Colorado River enters the Grand Canyon. The river there is not just water moving through rock. It is habitat, sediment, temperature, recreation, tribal homeland, sacred geography, and one of the most studied river corridors in the world. Releases from Glen Canyon Dam affect the timing, temperature, and volume of flows downstream. Those flows shape beaches, they affect fish, they affect rafting. They affect ecosystems that evolved around a river that once rose and fell according to snowmelt, floods, and seasons, not according to dam schedules and power demand. Then the circle widens again. Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam are part of a paired system with Lake Mead downstream. Powell is upstream storage. Mead is downstream storage. Together, they are the two giant shock absorbers of the Colorado River Basin. When Powell is protected by holding water back, Mead can feel the pressure. When Mead is protected by releasing more water, Powell can fall closer to critical thresholds. The system has no painless button. This is why the crisis cannot be reduced to one reservoir. Arizona depends heavily on Colorado River water. Nevada depends on it. Southern California depends on it. Farms in the Imperial Valley, cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, tribal nations with unresolved or underdeveloped water rights, and water users in Mexico are all tied into a river that has been promised, divided, litigated, engineered, pumped, and reused for more than a century. And all of this depends on something deceptively simple. The system has to be able to move water. That is where the official warnings matter. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation has warned that low inflow and dry conditions could push Lake Powell toward or below minimum power pool, the elevation near 3,490 feet, where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer produce hydropower as designed. In its low inflow projections, Reclamation described conditions that could bring the reservoir below that threshold without major intervention. That warning is not just about electricity. Hydropower is the visible concern because turbines either run or they do not. But power generation is connected to revenue. Revenue is connected to programs. Programs are connected to environmental work, salinity control, infrastructure, and the complicated financial machinery of the basin. When hydropower declines, the cost does not simply disappear. It moves. It can move to electric customers. It can move to federal budgets. It can move to replacement power markets. It can move to communities that were not part of the original decision, but now live with the consequences. And below minimum power pool, another problem begins to appear. Water releases become more constrained. Glen Canyon Dam was designed around multiple outlet structures, but not all outlets are equal. The turbines are not just power machines, they are also a major path by which water passes through the dam. When turbines cannot be used, operators must rely more heavily on lower capacity outlet works. That changes the flexibility of the system. In a wet year, flexibility can feel invisible. In a dry year, it becomes everything. The reason viewers should care is not that every city will suddenly run out of water tomorrow. That is not what the evidence says. The reason to care is more serious and more realistic. The Colorado River system is entering a zone where each decision has less margin for error. Hold water in Powell, and downstream users worry. Send water downstream, and Powell falls closer to critical levels. Protect hydropower, and water delivery rules come under strain. Protect deliveries, and power generation may suffer. Protect this year, and next year may become harder. This is the structure of a systemic threat. It does not arrive as a single disaster scene. It arrives as a shrinking menu of choices. A wildfire burns, a hurricane lands, a flood rises and recedes. Those events have obvious drama. Lake Powell's danger is quieter. It is a slow-moving compression of options. Each foot of elevation lost is not just a measurement, it is a reduction in control. That is why the image of the white line matters. It is not just a mark of where water used to be. It is a mark of how much buffer has already been consumed. And once you see Lake Powell not as scenery, but as storage, power, law, history, money, and survival time, the low water looks different. It does not look like a distant environmental problem. It looks like a warning from the machinery underneath modern life. Because in the American Southwest, the river is not just a river. It is a contract. It is a power plant. It is a food system. It is a border issue. It is a tribal justice issue. It is a climate signal. And right now, one of its largest reservoirs is sitting close enough to a major operating threshold that the entire system has to look down and calculate how much room is left. 3,528 feet means what? The number sounds precise, but it can be misleading if you do not know what it measures. When people say Lake Powell is near 3,528 feet, they are not saying the water is 3,528 feet deep. They are talking about elevation above sea level. The surface of the reservoir is sitting at that height. The number is not a depth gauge. It is a position on a vertical map of the dam. That distinction matters. A reservoir can hold millions of acre-feet of water and still be dangerously low for the way its infrastructure works. A person looking at a photograph may see a large blue lake and think, there is still plenty of water, and visually, that may seem true. Lake Powell is enormous even when depleted. It can still fill canyons, reflect the sky, and stretch beyond the horizon in certain arms. But dams do not operate on visual impressions. They operate through elevations. At the top of the useful scale is Full Pool, around 3,700 feet. That is the level many people associate with the old image of Lake Powell. Water high in the canyons, boat access more convenient, storage abundant, the reservoir doing what it was built to do. Far below that is Minimum Power Pool, around 3,490 feet. This is the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably generate hydropower. The turbines require enough hydraulic head, enough vertical pressure from water above the intakes to operate safely and effectively. Drop too low, and the power plant cannot function as intended. Below that, at around 3,370 feet, is Dead Pool. Dead Pool is one of those phrases that sounds like media exaggeration until you understand that it is a technical term. Reclamation has described elevation 3,370 feet as the point where no excess water can be passed through Glen Canyon Dam. Only the water entering the reservoir can be delivered downstream. That is the key. Dead pool does not mean there is no water. It means stored water loses its practical ability to be released through the dam in the way the system depends on. This is why 3,528 feet matters. At first glance, 3,528 is still 158 feet above Dead Pool. That can sound comforting. It can make the crisis seem far away. But the first critical threshold is not Dead Pool. It is Minimum Power Pool. From 3,528 feet to 3,490 feet is only about 38 feet. In ordinary life, 38 feet is not much. It is a little more than the height of a 3-story building. It is less than the length of many city buses. It is a number you could imagine crossing with a ladder truck, a small crane, or a few seconds in an elevator. But inside Lake Powell, those 38 feet are not just height. They are operating margin. They are the buffer between a dam that can produce hydropower and a dam that cannot. They are the distance between familiar management and emergency management. They are the last thickness of shock absorber before the system starts transmitting more force downstream and into institutions. Reclamation's reported status for Glen Canyon Dam recently placed Lake Powell at 3,526.99 feet, with storage of 5.62 million acre-feet, about 24% of live capacity. That phrase, live capacity, deserves attention. Live capacity refers to water that can be actively used or released. It is not the same as every drop physically present in the reservoir. Some water may sit below outlet elevations. Some may be functionally inaccessible. The useful part of the reservoir is the part that can be controlled. So, when a reservoir is at about a quarter of live capacity, the meaning is not simply, there is still 1/4 left. It is more like saying the emergency savings account of a household has been drawn down after years of shocks, while the monthly bills have not gone away. And the bills on the Colorado River are large. Cities need water. Farms need water. Hydropower customers need electricity. Ecosystems need flows. Tribes need legally recognized and physically usable rights. Mexico has treaty deliveries. Recreation economies need access. The lower basin expects releases. The upper basin worries about compact obligations. A reservoir at 24 or 25% of live capacity is not just low water, it is a system with less room to absorb mistakes. The acre-foot is another number that needs translating. 1 acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. It is about 325,851 gallons. In household terms, that sounds enormous. In Colorado River terms, it becomes a basic accounting unit. Millions of acre-feet move through plans, forecasts, reservoir charts, and negotiations. So when Lake Powell holds around 5.6 million acre-feet, that is still a staggering amount of water. But again, the danger is not solved by saying millions remain. The danger is about the relationship between remaining storage, incoming flow, required releases, evaporation, power generation, legal obligations, and the next dry year. A checking account can contain money and still be in trouble if rent, debt, medical bills, and payroll exceed what is coming in. A reservoir can contain water and still be in trouble if commitments exceed reliable supply. The deepest mistake is to imagine Lake Powell as a bowl. A bowl is passive, it holds whatever is poured into it. Lake Powell is not passive. It is part of an operating system. Water comes in from snowmelt and runoff across the upper Colorado River Basin. Water leaves through releases at Glen Canyon Dam. Some water evaporates, some is consumed upstream, some is regulated by law, some by hydrology, some by politics, some by engineering. Every foot of lake elevation is the result of these forces colliding. That is why the headline number has to be handled carefully. If you say, Lake Powell is near 3,528 feet, it sounds like a location, but if you understand the system, it sounds like a warning. Near 3,528 feet means far below full pool. It means only a narrow cushion above minimum power pool. It means a reservoir that has already lost much of the carryover storage that once made the river system feel more stable. It means the next snowpack, the next heat wave, the next release decision, and the next negotiation among states matter more than they used to. This is where everyday intuition fails. When a car's fuel tank is 1/4 full, you may not panic, you can drive to the next station. But imagine the same car is towing a heavy trailer down a mountain pass. The next gas station may be closed, the brakes are overheating, and 7 families are arguing over who gets dropped off first. That is closer to Lake Powell. The reservoir is not empty, but the system is heavy, the road is steep, and the margin is no longer comfortable. The reason this number shocks experts is not that 3,528 feet is magically catastrophic. It is that the number sits inside a cluster of thresholds, a little lower, and hydropower becomes endangered. Lower still, and release capacity becomes more constrained. Lower still, and dead pool changes the meaning of storage itself. This is the anatomy of systemic risk, not one cliff, but a staircase of cliffs. The public often notices only the final drop. System managers worry about the steps before it. Because by the time everyone agrees the crisis is obvious, many of the best options have already been spent. Not an empty lake, but a threshold problem. The most important sentence in this story is also the one that sounds least dramatic. Lake Powell is not at dead pool. That needs to be said clearly. It is not dead, it is not empty, it is not unable to release all water, it is not proof that every faucet in the southwest is about to run dry. But that statement does not make the situation safe. It makes the real problem more precise. The danger is not that the lake has already failed, the danger is that it is close enough to critical thresholds that the system has begun to behave differently before failure. This is what many headlines miss. They focus on the lake as an object, a body of water, a blue shape on a map, a place with boat ramps and canyon walls. But Lake Powell is not only a place, it is a piece of infrastructure, and infrastructure has thresholds. A bridge is not equally safe at every load. A hospital is not equally functional at every occupancy level. A power grid is not equally stable at every frequency. A dam is not equally flexible at every reservoir elevation. Below certain points, the structure may still exist, but its role changes. That is the hidden mechanism in this story. Not disappearance. Loss of control. When Lake Powell is comfortably above minimum power pool, Glen Canyon Dam can pass large volumes of water through its turbines while producing electricity. The dam can serve multiple functions at once, release water downstream, generate power, help meet operating rules, and produce revenue that supports basin programs. But as the reservoir approaches minimum power pool, the dam's abilities separate. Water release becomes one question. Power production becomes another. Infrastructure safety becomes another. Downstream obligations become another. The old assumption that one release can serve many purposes begins to weaken. That is why minimum power pool matters, even though dead pool is lower. Minimum power pool is not the bottom of the reservoir. It is the floor below which the hydropower function is no longer reliable. Reclamation has described 3,490 feet as the minimum power pool elevation, below which Glen Canyon Dam cannot generate hydropower in the usual way. That is a power problem, but it is more than a power problem. Hydropower from Glen Canyon Dam has long served electricity customers across the region. It has also generated revenue. That revenue supports the machinery of water management in ways most people never see. When the turbines produce less, the system has to replace that energy somewhere else, often at higher cost, and the financial structure changes. Then comes the deeper threshold, dead pool. Dead pool is where the stored water behind the dam can no longer be released downstream as excess water. Reclamation's definition is stark. At 3,370 feet, only the volume of water entering the reservoir can be delivered downstream. That is not the same as the lake is dry. It is stranger. It means a reservoir can still contain water, yet much of that water no longer functions as storage in the way society expects. Imagine a bank account with money trapped behind a frozen system. The number is not zero, but you cannot spend it when the bills arrive. Or imagine a warehouse full of food with the loading doors blocked. The food exists, but distribution fails. That is dead pool. The water is there, but the system cannot use it as designed. And that is why the phrase is so disturbing. It turns the crisis from a question of volume into a question of access. In water systems, access is everything. A city does not need water somewhere in the world. It needs water in pipes. A farm does not need water existing in a basin. It needs water at the head gate during the growing season. A dam does not need water trapped below its outlets. It needs water at elevations that allow controlled releases. A power plant does not need a scenic reservoir. It needs hydraulic head. This is the difference between water as a substance and water as a system. At Lake Powell, the system is defined by vertical geometry. The intakes, penstocks, outlet works, bypass tubes, and downstream channel are all built into a physical elevation structure. The lake can look vast from above and still be too low for parts of that structure. That is why a few dozen feet can matter so much. It is not because each foot contains the same amount of water. Reservoirs in canyons do not work like straight-sided tanks. The relationship between elevation and storage is irregular. At different levels, each foot can represent a different amount of volume. But operationally, the thresholds are clear. Above them, the system has choices. Near them, choices narrow. Below them, functions disappear. This is the core of the video. The threat is systemic because it attacks optionality. Optionality is the ability to choose among responses. In a wet system, managers have options. They can release, store, generate, conserve, negotiate, adjust, and recover. In a depleted system, each option becomes more expensive, more political, more technically constrained. That is how slow crises become sudden. The public sees a lake level falling gradually. Officials see operating space collapsing. Those are not the same thing. A slow decline can produce a fast decision point. This is not unique to Lake Powell. It is how many engineered systems fail under climate stress. A levee does not matter much until the water is 1 foot below the top. A power grid does not collapse gradually for the customer. It works until it does not. A reservoir does not become a crisis only at zero. It becomes a crisis when its function no longer matches society's expectations. That is where the Colorado River system now finds itself. For decades, the system was built around the assumption that large reservoirs could absorb variation. Wet years would refill, dry years would draw down. Over time, storage would smooth the river. But what happens when dry years cluster? What happens when warmer temperatures reduce runoff efficiency? What happens when soil absorbs more snowmelt before it reaches streams? What happens when demand remains built around the old river, but supply begins behaving like a different river? Then Lake Powell stops being merely a reservoir. It becomes a stress test. And the test is not asking whether concrete can stand. It is asking whether rules, expectations, economies, and infrastructure can adapt before the water crosses the next threshold. So the correct framing is not, is Lake Powell at dead pool? The correct framing is, how many critical functions are already being threatened before dead pool? That is a harder question. It is also the question that matters. Because dead pool is the dramatic phrase, minimum power pool is the nearer threshold, reduced release flexibility is the operational concern, declining storage is the Bayesian-wide warning, and loss of trust among water users may be the political danger that arrives before any physical limit is reached. A system can begin to fail socially before it fails hydraulically. States can begin protecting themselves. Cities can begin fearing shortages. Farmers can begin resisting cuts. Tribes can demand long-delayed rights. Power customers can face rising costs. Environmental flows can become harder to defend. Every group sees the same low reservoir, but each sees a different threat. This is why Lake Powell's level matters beyond hydrology. The lake is a shared buffer. When the buffer shrinks, conflict moves closer to the surface. The real fear is not that one number will suddenly end the West. The real fear is that the river system is losing the flexibility that allowed the West to pretend the hard choices could wait. Lake Powell is not empty. That is true. But the system around it is running out of room. And in a system built on room, that is the beginning of danger. Carryover storage is the river's shock absorber. To understand why Lake Powell matters, you have to understand a phrase that rarely appears in public conversation but quietly shapes the fate of the Colorado River. Carryover storage. It sounds technical, almost boring, but it is one of the most important ideas in the entire basin. Carryover storage is water saved from one year to help survive the next. It is the reason a dry year does not immediately become a disaster. It is the buffer between weather and people. It is the stored memory of past snowpack. If the Colorado River system were a household, snowpack would be the paycheck. Reservoirs would be the savings account. Water deliveries, power generation, cities, farms, ecosystems, and treaty obligations would be the bills. In a good year, the paycheck is large. Some bills are paid, and some money goes into savings. In a bad year, the paycheck is small, and the household survives by drawing from savings. That is how reservoirs are supposed to work. But if the household spends savings year after year, the problem changes. The next small paycheck is no longer an inconvenience. It is an emergency. That is what declining carryover storage does to a river system. It turns climate variability into direct impact. A wet year no longer simply helps. It has to repair damage from the previous dry years. A dry year no longer simply hurts. It cuts into functions the system depends on. Lake Powell is one of the major places where carryover storage lives. When Powell is high, the Colorado River system has time to negotiate, time to survive low snowpack, time to meet downstream demands, time to generate electricity, time to manage Lake Mead, time to adjust. When Powell is low, time disappears. This is why the best metaphor for Lake Powell is not a bathtub, it is a shock absorber. A shock absorber does not prevent every bump in the road. It absorbs force, so the vehicle does not break apart every time the wheels hit a hole. It turns sharp impacts into manageable movement. For decades, Lake Powell helped absorb the shocks of hydrology. A poor snowpack in the mountains did not immediately become a crisis for every downstream user because the reservoir could release stored water. A hot summer did not instantly rewrite every operating plan because storage provided cushion. A bad year could be carried. That was the point. But a shock absorber has limits. Compress it too far, and it stops absorbing. The next bump goes straight into the frame. Lake Powell near critical elevations means the Colorado River's shock absorber is already compressed. The next dry year, the next hot spring, the next disappointing runoff, the next legal standoff, these no longer land on a deep reservoir with abundant margin. They land on a system already close to its stops. That is the hidden mechanism behind the crisis. Not simply low water, reduced shock absorption. The Colorado River begins in snow. Much of its water supply depends on mountain snowpack in the upper basin. Snow accumulates through winter. In spring and early summer, it melts and feeds tributaries that eventually send water toward Lake Powell. But snowpack is not the same as runoff. This is one of the most important climate details in the West. A mountain can have snow, but not all of that snow becomes river flow. Some sublimates directly into vapor, Some evaporates, some soaks into dry soil, some is taken up by vegetation, some is lost before it reaches streams. In a warmer and drier landscape, runoff efficiency can decline. That means the same amount of snow may produce less water in the river than people expect. The basin can look healthier in winter than it feels by summer. That is why water managers watch not only snowpack, but soil moisture, temperature, precipitation timing, and forecast inflows. A reservoir crisis begins long before the lake level changes. It begins in the mountains. It begins in dry soil. It begins when a warm spring pulls water into the atmosphere faster than the river can collect it. It begins when the old relationship between snow and runoff weakens. Then the weakened runoff arrives at Lake Powell, and the reservoir has to answer a question: can it absorb another bad year? If carryover storage is high, the answer may be yes. If carryover storage is low, the answer becomes uncertain. This is where the 3,528-foot number becomes more than a measurement. It becomes evidence that the storage account has already been drawn down. Reclamation's recent reporting showed Lake Powell at roughly a quarter of live capacity, with storage near 5.6 million acre-feet. Again, that is still a vast volume of water. But the Colorado River system is vast too. The demands are vast. The legal promises are vast. The climate stress is vast. And the reservoir is being asked to perform as though the past is still available. The system was built in an era when people believed large dams could tame uncertainty. That belief was not irrational. For much of the 20th century, reservoirs did provide a sense of control. Floods could be moderated, water could be stored, cities could grow, farms could expand, hydropower could be generated, recreation economies could develop. But control depended on replenishment. A savings account is powerful only if income eventually catches up. The Colorado River has entered an era where that assumption is under pressure. The term often used is aridification. Drought suggests a temporary shortage, a dry spell that eventually ends. Aridification suggests a shift toward a drier baseline, driven in part by warming temperatures. The difference is crucial. If the basin is only in a drought, then waiting for recovery may be a strategy. If the basin is aridifying, waiting becomes denial. Lake Powell forces that distinction into view. A reservoir can recover after wet years. Lake Powell may rise again after strong snowpack. It has risen before. It can rise again. That matters, because the story should not become fatalistic. But recovery from one year does not automatically restore the old baseline. A single wet year can refill part of a reservoir. It cannot repeal warming. It cannot erase overallocation. It cannot rebuild trust. It cannot guarantee the next year. That is why systemic risk grows even when the lake sometimes rises. The issue is not whether Powell has seasonal fluctuations. It always has. The issue is whether the long-term buffer is enough for the long-term obligations. Carryover storage is where that question becomes real. When storage falls, every forecast matters more. A 2-4-month study becomes not just a technical document, but a political signal. A snowpack update becomes a financial concern. A release schedule becomes a negotiation. A few feet of reservoir elevation become a headline. That is what happens when a system loses slack. Slack is the invisible space that keeps problems from cascading. In a healthy system, slack absorbs errors. A shipment is delayed, but inventory covers it. A generator fails, but reserve capacity covers it. A dry year arrives, but reservoir storage covers it. In a brittle system, slack is gone. A small failure spreads. A delay becomes a shortage. A dry year becomes a crisis. Lake Powell's low level is a measure of reduced slack. That is why the crisis can seem slow and sudden at the same time. The decline happens over years, but the consequences concentrate at thresholds. The public sees gradual change. Operators see cliff edges. The shock absorber metaphor also explains why the danger is shared unevenly. When a vehicle's shock absorber fails, every passenger feels the bump, but not equally. The person in the safest seat with a seatbelt may be shaken. The person standing in the back may be thrown. In the Colorado River Basin, those standing in the back are communities with fewer resources, weaker infrastructure, unresolved rights, higher energy burdens, or fewer alternatives. A wealthy city may buy replacement power. A small community may face higher rates, A large agricultural district may hire lawyers. A tribal community may still be waiting for the infrastructure needed to use water it has rights to, on paper. A recreation business may lose a season. A fish cannot negotiate. Carryover storage, therefore, has a moral dimension. It is not just hydrology, it is the shared margin that protects the vulnerable from immediate impact. When that margin shrinks, inequality becomes more visible. This is why Deadpool is a systemic threat even before it arrives. The approach to Deadpool forces choices. Those choices reveal power. They reveal who gets protected, who gets compensated, who waits, who sacrifices, and who is told the crisis is unfortunate but unavoidable. The lake level is physical. The response is political. And the mechanism linking them is storage. There is another way to think about it. Imagine the Colorado River as a long, tense rope stretched across the west. On that rope hang cities, farms, power systems, ecosystems, tribal nations, recreation economies, and legal agreements. Lake Powell is not the rope. It is one of the heavy counterweights that keeps the rope from jerking too violently when conditions change. As Powell falls, the counterweight gets lighter. The rope tightens. Every movement travels farther. That is the story beneath the headline. The danger is not just that Lake Powell is near 3,528 feet. The danger is that the basin's stored ability to absorb shock has been spent down, and the system is still behaving as though the cushion is larger than it is. So when someone asks, how much water is left? The better question is, how much time is left? Because in a managed river, storage is time. It is time before shortage, time before conflict, time before emergency releases, time before hydropower loss, time before downstream risk, time before forced adaptation. Lake Powell is not merely holding water. It is holding time. And the water level tells us how much of that time has already been used. The near-threshold years warned us already. The current danger at Lake Powell did not appear out of nowhere. It has been building in public, in data, in emergency decisions, and in the uncomfortable memory of recent years when the reservoir moved close enough to critical levels that federal officials had to act. The years around 2021 to 2023 were a warning. During that period, Lake Powell fell to some of the lowest elevations seen since it first filled. The reservoir approached minimum power pool closely enough that protecting Glen Canyon Dam became a central concern. Federal agencies adjusted releases, held water back, and used upstream reservoirs to help prop up Powell. Those measures were not normal background management. They were defensive moves. They showed that the system had entered a new kind of operating environment, one where a giant reservoir that once symbolized abundance now needed emergency protection from falling too low to perform its own functions. That is the historical layer. The Colorado River system was built around confidence in storage. Glen Canyon Dam was authorized as part of a broader project to help the upper basin develop water, regulate the river, generate electricity, and meet obligations downstream. Lake Powell became the upstream bank account that helped the upper basin manage its relationship with the lower basin. But the legal and engineering architecture of the river grew from assumptions made in a different hydrologic era. The Colorado River Compact divided the river between upper and lower basin states in the early 20th century. The compact and later agreements formed what is often called the law of the river, a layered structure of compacts, treaties, court decisions, statutes, operating rules, and contracts. This legal architecture tried to turn a variable river into an allocatable resource. But the river did not become less variable just because the law divided it. In fact, the long-term record suggests that the early 20th century was not a perfect guide to the river's future. Many researchers and water historians have argued that the river was overestimated when the legal framework was created. The basin then added a second pressure, growth. Cities expanded, agriculture intensified, infrastructure locked in expectations. The region built itself around access to water that was never as secure as people wanted to believe. Then warming made the math harder. The recent Megadrought in the American Southwest has been described by researchers as one of the most severe in at least 1,200 years, with human-caused climate change making it significantly worse. A major study published in Nature Climate Change found that climate change accounted for a substantial portion of the severity of the 2021 Megadrought. That does not mean every low lake level is caused by climate change in a simple one-to-one way. It means the background conditions have changed. Higher temperatures increase evaporation demand, drier soils reduce runoff efficiency, snowmelt timing shifts. The river receives less usable water from the same landscape. The old range of expectations becomes less reliable. Lake Powell became one of the places where that new reality showed itself. Reclamation has reported that the 2022 period produced the lowest 2-3-year inflow sequence into Lake Powell since Glen Canyon Dam closed in the 1960s, and that 2021 was one of the driest inflow years on record for the reservoir. That is not a small footnote. It means the reservoir has already lived through a historically severe sequence. The current concern is not based on one bad forecast, one dry month, or one alarming photograph. It is based on a reservoir that has endured more than 2 decades of stress, while demands and obligations remain immense. There is also a deeper historical irony. Glen Canyon Dam was built partly to create control over extremes. In the 20th century, the fear was not only drought, it was also flood. Dams promised to capture spring runoff, reduce downstream risk, store water for dry periods, and generate hydropower. But infrastructure built to manage one set of extremes can become vulnerable when the pattern of extremes changes. In the early 1980s, Glen Canyon Dam faced the opposite problem: too much water. High inflows forced the use of spillways, and high-velocity water caused damaging cavitation in spillway tunnels. That event became a famous reminder that even massive dams are not invincible. They depend on assumptions about flow, pressure, materials, and operating conditions. Today, the concern is low water instead of high water. But the lesson is similar. The dam is powerful, but not magical. It has design limits. Those limits matter most when the river behaves outside the range people expected. The 1980s showed the danger of too much water arriving too fast. The 2020s show the danger of too little water arriving for too long. Both reveal the same truth. Infrastructure is a bet on future conditions. When the future changes, the bet has to be re-examined. Lake Powell's recent low-water years also changed public consciousness. For decades, many people saw the reservoir as permanent. The lake had become part of the identity of the region. Houseboats, fishing, red rock scenery, and marina culture made it feel like a fixed feature of the landscape. Then the shoreline retreated. Places that had been underwater reappeared. Canyons emerged. Old landscapes returned. Some people saw ecological restoration. Others saw economic threat. Some saw an argument for draining Powell. Others saw evidence that the reservoir must be protected. The same falling water produced opposite meanings. That is what makes Lake Powell politically explosive. It is not only a reservoir, it is a symbol, and symbols divide. For some, Powell represents human arrogance, a drowned canyon, a dammed river, an artificial lake in a drying region. For others, Powell represents security, stored water, hydropower, recreation, jobs, and the upper basin's protection under the law of the river. For many communities, it is both at once. That tension matters because future decisions will not be made by hydrology alone. They will be made by institutions under pressure, and institutions carry history. The near-threshold years proved that emergency actions are possible. Water can be held back, releases can be adjusted, upstream reservoirs can be used, shortage agreements can be negotiated, conservation can be paid for, cities can reduce demand, farmers can fallow fields, federal agencies can intervene. But those same years also proved that emergency actions have limits. Holding water in Powell affects Mead. Releasing water to Mead affects Powell. Using upstream reservoirs affects those reservoirs. Temporary conservation does not automatically solve long-term overuse. Paying users not to use water may buy time, but it does not answer the deeper question of how much water the basin can sustainably promise. This is the trap of crisis management. It can prevent collapse. It can also delay transformation. A system that survives one emergency may be tempted to return to old habits. But Lake Powell's repeated low levels suggest that the old habits are part of the risk. The historical lesson is not simply that the system has been stressed before. The lesson is that the system has already shown us where it is weak. It is weak where legal promises exceed reliable supply. It is weak where hydropower revenue depends on reservoir elevation. It is weak where downstream deliveries depend on upstream storage. It is weak where tribal water rights exist on paper, but infrastructure lags behind. It is weak where cities assume conservation can substitute forever for hard allocation choices. It is weak where a wet year is mistaken for recovery. This is why the present level matters. It comes after the warning. If this were the first time Powell had dropped, the public might treat it as a surprise, but it is not the first time. The basin has already seen what happens when Powell approaches critical thresholds. It has already seen emergency memos, altered release plans, infrastructure adaptations, and tense negotiations. The system has been warned, and that makes the current moment more serious, not less. A first warning can be dismissed as bad luck. A repeated warning becomes evidence. The Colorado River system is now living inside that evidence. Lake Powell near 3,528 feet is not an isolated snapshot. It is the latest frame in a long sequence. Over-allocation, warming, dry soils, low inflow, falling reservoirs, emergency action, partial recovery, renewed decline, and another approach toward threshold. That is what a pattern looks like. Not a straight line. A tightening spiral. Each pass around the spiral brings the system closer to the same questions. How much water is really available? Who cuts first? Who decides? Who pays? Who is protected? Who is left exposed? History does not answer those questions for us, but it does remove one excuse. No one can say the warning signs were invisible. Real vulnerability lies below the falling surface. The most dangerous impacts of Lake Powell's decline do not wait for dead pool. They begin earlier, in the lives of people and systems that depend on stability. A falling reservoir is easy to photograph. Vulnerability is harder to see. It is in the monthly electric bill. It is in the seasonal job that disappears when boat access changes. It is in the water intake that has to be modified before the lake falls too far. It is in the farmer who needs to know whether planting makes sense. It is in the tribal community that has legal rights but inadequate infrastructure. It is in the power customer who never thinks about Glen Canyon Dam until replacement electricity becomes more expensive. This is why the human layer matters. Without it, Lake Powell becomes a graph. With it, Lake Powell becomes a warning about inequality inside infrastructure. Start near the dam. Reclamation completed work on a new water intake connection at Glen Canyon Dam to help ensure water deliveries to Page, Arizona, and the Lecce chapter of the Navajo Nation, even if the reservoir drops to dead pool. That detail is revealing. A system that once assumed high water now needs specific low water adaptations to keep nearby communities supplied. This does not mean those communities are doomed. It means low water forces infrastructure to be reworked, often under pressure, often at high cost, and often after decades in which the old design seems sufficient. That is the first vulnerability, dependence on fixed infrastructure in a moving climate. Water intakes are built at elevations, boat ramps are built to reach shorelines, marinas are anchored to expected lake levels, turbines are designed for hydraulic head, canals, pumps, and contracts are built around assumed deliveries. When the water moves outside those assumptions, people discover how much of modern life was designed for a narrower range of conditions. Then there is the power system. Glen Canyon Dam's hydropower does not only matter because it generates electricity, it matters because of who receives that power and how it is priced. Federal hydropower in the West has historically supported public power customers, irrigation districts, rural utilities, tribal customers, municipalities, and other users through long-term arrangements. If Glen Canyon Dam produces less hydropower, replacement power must come from somewhere. Depending on market conditions, that replacement power can cost more. Higher costs can move through utilities and eventually reach customers. For a wealthy household, a higher bill is frustrating. For a low-income household, it can become a crisis. Energy burden is not evenly distributed. Poorer households spend a larger share of income on utilities. Rural systems may have fewer alternatives. Tribal communities often face infrastructure inequities rooted in long histories of underinvestment. So when hydropower declines, the financial impact is not spread evenly across society. The same is true for water. A large city may have multiple tools: conservation programs, tiered pricing, groundwater banking, wastewater reuse, interconnections, legal staff, bond capacity, and political influence. A small community may have far fewer options. A major agricultural district may be able to negotiate compensation for conservation. An individual farm worker may simply lose income if fields are fallowed. A tribe may hold senior water rights but lack the pipes, treatment plants, funding, or legal settlement mechanisms needed to fully use them. This is one of the central injustices of Western water. Rights on paper do not always equal water in practice. The Colorado River Basin includes many tribal nations. Some have quantified rights. Some have unresolved claims. Some have settlements awaiting infrastructure. Many have watched a river system built across their homelands while benefits flowed unevenly. As Lake Powell falls and the basin turns toward shortage management, tribal water issues become impossible to ignore, not because they are new, but because scarcity reveals unfinished business. A full system can hide injustice. A stressed system exposes it. Then there are farmers. Agriculture uses a large share of Colorado River water. That fact is often discussed as if it settles the debate: cut agriculture, save the cities. But the reality is more complicated. Farms produce food, jobs, regional economies, and cultural landscapes. Some grow high-value crops. Some grow forage. Some irrigation practices are inefficient. Some have already conserved. Some water rights are legally senior. Some communities depend almost entirely on farm income. The point is not that agriculture should be immune from cuts. The point is that cuts are not abstractions. A field left dry is also a worker not hired, a tractor not financed, a supplier not paid, a town losing revenue, a family recalculating its future. That is why shortage policy is so hard. Water saved in one place can create pain in another. The basin needs conservation, but conservation is not morally simple unless the costs are recognized and shared. Lake Powell's decline also affects recreation. Recreation can sound less serious than drinking water or farming, but in places like Page, recreation is livelihood. Marinas, guides, mechanics, hotels, restaurants, gas stations, rental companies, park staff, and seasonal workers all depend on people being able to access the lake. When water drops, launch ramps may close or require extensions. Marinas may move, travel patterns shift, safety conditions change, businesses face uncertainty. A falling reservoir becomes an economic stressor before it becomes an engineering failure. Then there is the Grand Canyon. Below Glen Canyon Dam, the river is managed through releases that affect ecosystems, beaches, temperature, sediment, and recreation. The dam already transformed the river by trapping sediment and changing seasonal flows. Low reservoir conditions can add new complications, including warmer releases, altered flow flexibility, and operational constraints. The people most visibly connected to the river there include river guides, scientists, park visitors, tribal nations with deep cultural ties to the canyon, and communities that depend on the river corridor. But the canyon also represents something larger: the question of whether engineered rivers can still support living systems under climate stress. A river is not only a delivery channel, it is habitat. It is temperature. It is sediment. It is timing. It is migration, spawning, food webs, beaches, springs, and cultural memory. When Lake Powell falls, those downstream relationships can change. The vulnerability is not only human, and it is not only ecological, it is institutional. The Colorado River system depends on cooperation among states, federal agencies, tribes, irrigation districts, cities, power customers, Mexico, environmental groups, and courts. That cooperation is easier when reservoirs are high. There is more water to paper over conflict. Deals can be delayed. Ambiguities can remain unresolved. Low reservoirs remove ambiguity. They force accounting. They force questions that everyone knows are coming, but no one wants to answer too early. Who takes the shortage? Should cuts be based on legal priority, recent use, equity, public health, economics, or hydrologic reality? Should cities cut outdoor use before farms fallow fields? Should senior rights be protected, even if the system as a whole is failing? How should tribal rights be incorporated into a river already overpromised? How much water should remain for ecosystems? How much should be stored for future years instead of delivered now? These questions are not technical side issues, they are the crisis. The falling lake is the visible symptom. The allocation conflict is the disease. And beneath both is a deeper vulnerability. The basin was built around expansion. Expansion of cities. Expansion of irrigated land. Expansion of energy demand. Expansion of legal claims. Expansion of confidence. A shrinking water supply colliding with expansion logic produces systemic stress. That stress shows up first, where people have the least cushion. This is why the phrase "dead pool" can be misleading if it makes people wait for a final dramatic threshold. The vulnerable do not wait that long. They experience the crisis as a sequence. First, uncertainty. Then higher costs. Then infrastructure modification. Then reduced reliability. Then emergency rules. Then cuts. Then legal conflict. Then migration of economic activity. Then loss of trust. By the time dead pool becomes the headline, many communities may already have been living with the consequences for years. So when we talk about Lake Powell near 3,528 feet, we should not only ask how far the water is above dead pool, we should ask how far people are above their own thresholds. How far is a small utility above unaffordable replacement power? How far is a marina above closure? How far is a farm above financial collapse? How far is a tribe above another delayed promise? How far is a city above mandatory cuts? How far is an ecosystem above irreversible change? Those thresholds are not all measured in feet. Some are measured in dollars. Some in jobs. Some in trust. Some in temperature. Some in law. Some in time. That is what makes Lake Powell a systemic threat. It connects physical elevation to social fragility. The lake falls in feet. The consequences spread in lives. One reservoir becomes a test of baseline. Lake Powell is not just revealing a water shortage. It is revealing a baseline problem. A baseline is what a system assumes is normal. It is the background condition around which plans are built. For the Colorado River, the old baseline included a belief that dry years would be balanced by wet years, that reservoirs could refill often enough, that legal allocations could be managed through engineering, and that demand could keep expanding so long as conservation improved. That baseline is now under pressure. The new baseline is hotter. It is more uncertain. It is less forgiving. And it may not support the same promises. This is the hardest part of the story because it asks people to change not only policy, but imagination. The Southwest has spent generations imagining water scarcity as a problem to be solved by the next project, the next reservoir, the next canal, the next transfer, the next efficiency gain, the next emergency agreement. But Lake Powell suggests the problem may be deeper. What if the system is not experiencing a temporary shortage? What if it is encountering the limits of a water model built for a cooler century? That does not mean the Colorado River Basin has no future. It means the future cannot be managed honestly if the old baseline remains hidden inside the decisions. The physical mechanisms are now familiar. Warming raises atmospheric thirst. The air can pull more moisture from soil, plants, reservoirs, and snow. Dry soils absorb meltwater before it reaches streams. Snow may melt earlier. Heat can reduce runoff efficiency. Evaporation from reservoirs and canals becomes more consequential. Demand spikes during hotter periods. Wildfire, forest change, and dust on snow can alter watershed behavior. Each factor matters. Together, they change the river. Not always in a straight line, not every year, not everywhere equally, but enough to make the old expectation less reliable. This is why a wet year can be emotionally dangerous. A strong snowpack can raise Lake Powell, a good runoff season can improve headlines, boat ramps can reopen, officials can sound relieved, the public can conclude the crisis is over. But in a changed baseline, a wet year is not proof of recovery. It is a deposit into a depleted account. Important, valuable, necessary, but not enough by itself. The basin now needs to distinguish between relief and recovery. Relief is when the reservoir rises. Recovery is when the system's long-term demands match its long-term supply. Lake Powell can provide relief. Only policy can provide recovery. And that policy must face the paired nature of Powell and Mead. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are often discussed separately, but operationally they are linked. Powell sits upstream of Glen Canyon Dam. Mead sits downstream of Hoover Dam. Water released from Powell contributes to Mead. Water held in Powell may protect Glen Canyon Dam, but reduce downstream support. Water released to support Mead may lower Powell and threaten hydropower. This creates a basin-wide tension. Protect Powell, and the lower basin worries. Protect Mead, and the upper basin worries. Protect power, and water delivery flexibility narrows. Protect deliveries, and power generation may suffer. Protect today, and next year may become more exposed. This is not a conspiracy. It is geometry, law, and scarcity. There is only so much water. Once storage falls, every use competes more directly with every other use. This is why Lake Powell is a test of governance. The old system was built around allocating water. The new challenge is allocating shortage. Those are different political tasks. Allocating water allows leaders to promise growth. Allocating shortage forces leaders to define limits. It asks who gives up what, when, under what authority, and with what compensation. It asks whether legal priority should dominate, whether public health should override seniority, whether equity should reshape old rights, whether ecosystems deserve enforceable water, and how tribal sovereignty fits into a basin already stretched beyond its reliable supply. Those questions cannot be answered by hydrology alone, but hydrology is making them unavoidable. Lake Powell near critical elevations is a pressure gauge on the entire governance system. If the basin responds only with emergency transfers, temporary deals, and one-year patches, it may avoid immediate catastrophe while deepening long-term risk. If it responds with structural demand reduction, honest accounting, tribal inclusion, ecosystem protection, and new operating rules, it may become a model for adaptation. That is the fork in the road. One path treats Lake Powell's low level as an emergency to survive. The other treats it as evidence that the operating system must be rewritten. The difference matters because climate stress is not waiting. The Colorado River is not the only system facing this problem. Around the world, reservoirs, aquifers, levees, grids, ports, roads, and insurance systems are being tested by conditions outside their historical design assumptions. A dam designed around one hydrologic range confronts another. A city built for one flood frequency faces another. A power grid designed for one heat profile faces another. A forest managed for one fire regime faces another. Lake Powell is part of that global story. It shows how climate change often enters society through infrastructure, not as an abstract temperature anomaly, not as a line on a global chart, but as a reservoir approaching an outlet threshold, a turbine losing hydraulic head, a water intake needing modification, a release schedule becoming politically explosive, a community wondering whether the system it depends on was built for a world that no longer exists. This is the investigative core. Climate risk becomes real when it meets design limits. The Glen Canyon Dam does not care about political talking points. It responds to water elevation, pressure, flow paths, structural capacity, and operating rules. The river does not care about wishful accounting. It responds to snow, heat, soil, evaporation, and gravity. That does not remove human responsibility. It sharpens it. Because humans built the promises. Humans built the demand. Humans built the legal structure. Humans built the dam. Humans can also change the rules. But changing rules under stress is harder than changing them before stress. That is why waiting is costly. The closer Lake Powell gets to critical thresholds, the more every decision becomes reactive. Reactive systems often protect the most powerful interests first, because those interests are organized, represented, and legally armed. A planned transition can be negotiated. A crisis transition is imposed. This is where the new baseline question becomes unavoidable. Is 3,528 feet an anomaly inside an old normal? Or is it a signal from a new normal where reservoirs spend more time near dangerous thresholds? The answer may not be simple. Lake levels will still rise and fall. There will still be wet years. There will still be heavy snowpacks. There will still be floods. Climate change does not eliminate variability. It changes the odds, the intensity, the timing, and the consequences. That is why communication has to be careful. It would be wrong to say Lake Powell will only go down forever. It would also be wrong to treat every rise as salvation. The truth is more uncomfortable. Variability now operates on top of depletion. Wet years can help, but they may not rebuild the margin fast enough if demand remains too high and warming continues. That is the new baseline risk. Not permanent decline in a straight line. Permanent pressure on the margin. A system can survive permanent pressure, but only if it admits the pressure exists. The Colorado River Basin is now negotiating its future operating rules. Those negotiations are not just bureaucratic, they are a contest over reality. Will the rules assume a river that history no longer supports? Or will they assume a river that is hotter, less predictable, and already overpromised? Lake Powell is the evidence sitting in plain sight. Its white ring is not only a mark of past water, it is a mark of past assumptions. The assumption that storage would refill. The assumption that growth could continue. The assumption that legal paper could outrun hydrology. The assumption that engineering could always create more time. Now the lake is asking whether those assumptions still hold. And the answer will shape not only the next operating plan, but the future of the Southwest. Because the true crisis is not low water alone. It is a society built to expect more certainty than the river can now provide. Truth, hype, uncertainty, and the real risk. This part matters because a crisis can be exaggerated in ways that weaken public trust. And Lake Powell does not need exaggeration. The facts are serious enough. So let us separate what is true, what is related, what is uncertain, and what is misleading. First, Lake Powell near 3,528 feet does not mean dead pool has arrived. It has not. Dead pool is around 3,370 feet. That is far lower than the present level. Anyone claiming the lake is already at dead pool is wrong. Second, minimum power pool is not the same as dead pool. Minimum power pool is around 3,490 feet, the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer reliably produce hydropower. Dead pool is lower, where stored water can no longer be passed downstream as excess water in the same way. These are different thresholds with different consequences. Confusing them creates panic instead of understanding. Third, dead pool does not mean Lake Powell becomes bone dry. That phrase sounds like the lake turns into dust. Technically, it means the reservoir has dropped to a level where the dam can no longer release stored water downstream beyond what is flowing into the reservoir. Water may remain behind the dam, but it is no longer useful as controllable storage in the same way. Reclamation's definition is clear on this point. Fourth, a single dry year does not prove climate change by itself. Weather still varies. Snowpack still varies. Runoff still varies. One season can be low for many reasons. Another can be high. It is bad science to take one reservoir level and claim it alone proves a global trend. But fifth, the long-term pattern is strongly connected to warming and aridification. Multiple decades of hotter, drier conditions, low inflows, soil moisture stress, declining runoff efficiency, and historically severe megadrought conditions form the larger context. The scientific concern is not one bad year. It is a long period of stress made worse by a warmer climate. That distinction is essential. The truthful statement is not, climate change caused this lake level today in a simple, direct way. The truthful statement is, a warmer and drier climate background is increasing the risk that Lake Powell spends more time near critical operating thresholds. That is more precise. It is also more alarming because it describes a structural condition rather than a single event. Sixth, the white bathtub ring is real evidence, but not a full explanation. The ring shows where water used to be. It is a powerful visual sign of decline from higher reservoir levels, but by itself, it does not tell us why the water fell. The cause involves inflow, releases, evaporation, upstream use, drought, warming, operating rules, and demand. A photograph can show change, It cannot explain the entire system. Seventh, recreation impacts are real, but they are not the same as basin collapse. Closed ramps, moved marinas, exposed canyon walls, and changed lake access matter to local economies and visitors. They are part of the story. But the deeper risk is not whether a certain boat ramp remains usable. The deeper risk is whether the reservoir can keep serving as storage, power source, and operating buffer. Eighth, the dam is not about to explode because the lake is low. That kind of claim should be treated with caution unless supported by specific engineering evidence. Low water creates serious operational problems, especially around hydropower and release capacity. It does not automatically imply sudden structural failure. The real risk is less cinematic. It is the loss of function. A dam can remain standing while becoming less useful. A reservoir can remain visible while becoming less reliable. A system can continue operating while losing resilience. That is harder to communicate than a disaster movie, but it is closer to reality. Ninth, debates about draining Lake Powell, bypassing Glen Canyon Dam, modifying outlets, or prioritizing Lake Mead are policy debates, not simple scientific conclusions. There are arguments on multiple sides. Some environmental advocates see the falling reservoir as evidence that Glen Canyon should be restored and Lake Mead should become the primary storage facility. Others argue that Powell remains essential for upper basin security, hydropower, and compact management. Engineers raise questions about outlet capacity, sediment, infrastructure, and downstream impacts. Tribes, states, cities, farmers, and conservation groups all have different stakes. The science can inform these debates. It cannot remove the politics. 10th, the real danger is not a single threshold in isolation. It is the chain. Low inflow reduces storage. Low storage narrows operating flexibility. Narrow flexibility threatens hydropower. Hydropower loss affects revenue and power customers. Reduced release flexibility affects downstream planning. Downstream uncertainty increases political conflict. Political conflict slows adaptation. Slow adaptation increases risk before the next dry year. That chain is the systemic threat. This is why dead pool matters even though it has not arrived. It is the final name attached to a process that begins earlier. It is the end point that reveals the direction of risk. Think of a medical warning. A doctor may say a patient is not in cardiac arrest. That is good news. But if blood pressure, cholesterol, oxygen levels, and warning symptoms are all moving in the wrong direction, the correct response is not complacency. The correct response is intervention before the worst threshold is crossed. Lake Powell is not at dead pool. That is good. Lake Powell is close enough to minimum power pool that official forecasts and emergency planning have focused on protecting critical elevations. That is serious. Both statements can be true. Good analysis keeps both in view. This is where the video must resist cheap fear. Fear built on exaggeration burns out quickly. Fear built on facts becomes attention, and attention is what this river system needs. The public does not need to be told that the Southwest ends tomorrow. The public needs to understand that the system is being forced into choices it spent decades avoiding. That is the real risk. Not instant apocalypse. A narrowing future. Not one collapse. A sequence of thresholds. Not a dry lake bed. A reservoir that still holds water but no longer holds enough time. When we keep those distinctions clear, the story becomes more credible and more disturbing. Because the honest version is not comforting. It says the catastrophe does not begin at dead pool. It begins when people keep pretending dead pool is the only line that matters. At the White Ring, the future chooses. Return to the edge of Lake Powell. The water is still there. The cliffs still rise. The dam still stands. The river still moves. From a distance, the system can look intact. That is the unsettling thing about systemic risk. It often looks normal right before it becomes undeniable. The bridge is still open, the grid is still powered, the reservoir still reflects the sky. The contracts still exist, the maps still show the river in blue. But underneath, the margin has changed. Lake Powell near 3,528 feet is not the end of the Colorado River system. It is not dead pool. It is not proof that everyone downstream is about to lose water overnight. It is something more useful than a panic headline. It is a warning with measurements. A warning that full pool is far above. A warning that minimum power pool is much closer. A warning that dead pool is not an imaginary term but a real operating limit. A warning that storage is not just water. Storage is time. And the West has spent much of that time. For a century, the Colorado River was treated as something that could be mastered through concrete, law, pumps, canals, turbines, and negotiation. That project created cities, farms, electricity, and wealth. It also created dependence. It encouraged millions of people to live inside a system that assumed the river would remain generous enough, or that engineering would remain powerful enough, to cover the difference. Now the river is asking for an audit. Not an audit of one reservoir. An audit of assumptions. How much water can the basin really count on? How much demand can it really support? How should shortages be shared? How will tribal rights be honored not only legally, but physically? How much risk should be placed on future generations? How long can emergency measures substitute for structural change? These are not questions for some distant climate future. They are the questions that appear when a reservoir approaches operating thresholds. The hopeful part is that thresholds can be warnings before they become endings. The basin still has choices. Cities can reduce demand further, especially outdoor demand that exists because past water seemed more reliable than future water may be. Agriculture can be supported through smarter conservation, compensated reductions, crop transitions, infrastructure improvements, and policies that do not simply abandon rural communities. Tribal nations can be brought into decision-making as sovereign governments with real water rights, not as afterthoughts in a system built around others. Hydropower planning can prepare for lower generation instead of being shocked by it. Environmental flows can be treated as part of river health, not as leftovers after every other use. Operating rules can be rewritten around a hotter, more variable basin. And the public can learn a harder truth. Conservation is not just a personal virtue, it is a system design question. But the non-comforting part is just as important. None of this becomes easier by waiting. Every year of delay spends storage. Every emergency patch spends trust. Every wet year mistaken for recovery spends political will. Every argument over the past steals time from the future. Lake Powell may rise again. A strong snow season could lift the reservoir. A series of wet years could change the immediate mood. People may return to ramps that were closed. Headlines may soften. The white ring may partly disappear underwater. But the question will remain. Did the basin use that water as relief or as an excuse? That is the difference between adaptation and denial. Relief says, we have more time to change. Denial says, we do not have to change. Lake Powell is warning against denial. Because the lake does not need to be empty to expose the truth, it only needs to fall far enough that the system's hidden dependencies become visible. The power plant depends on elevation. The downstream river depends on releases. The releases depend on storage. The storage depends on inflow. The inflow depends on snow, temperature, soil, and climate. The law depends on assumptions. The communities depend on all of it. That chain is the story. A lake near 3,528 feet is not simply a lake near 3,528 feet. It is the visible surface of a much deeper system. And dead pool is not only a line below it. Dead pool is the name of what happens when a society discovers that water can still exist, but the old promise of control has failed. So the final image is not a dry lake bed. It is more haunting than that. It is a wide blue reservoir under a hard desert sky, a concrete dam holding back water that still looks immense, and a pale white ring on the canyon walls showing how much confidence has already drained away. The event will change. The lake will rise and fall. The forecasts will update. The negotiations will continue. But what Lake Powell has revealed will remain. The systems we built to smooth the climate of the past are now being tested by the climate of the future. And the question is no longer whether the river can be forced to obey the old calendar. The question is whether people can change faster than the water is falling.